Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Always exciting.
Today, we're tackling a figure who's become really central in Nigerian politics.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Nnamdi Kanu.
A lightning rod, you could say,
That's a great way to put it.
for all the struggles and arguments over Biafran independence.
Definitely. And to understand him, I think you have to understand like all these layers of history and politics and even religion.
Oh, yeah.
All wrapped up in this one individual.
And a very outspoken individual at that.
Very outspoken. So for our listener who might not know Kanu, let's go back to the beginning.
Okay.
He was born in 1967.
Wow.
Right in the middle of the Nigerian Civil War.
In the very region that would become Biafra, if only for a short time.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to grasp, like, how deep his commitment is to Biafran independence.
Yeah.
This isn't just like an abstract political idea for him.
Right.
This is deeply personal. It's rooted in his experience of war.
Yeah.
And it's rooted in the aspirations of a whole generation.
And it's not just the timing of his birth. His family background really plays a role, too.
It does.
Both of his parents were traditional monarchs.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong foundation when we're talking about leadership and cultural identity.
Yeah.
And you can see that influence in how he approaches activism.
Absolutely.
He's not a follower, he's a leader.
Right.
And it started early on. He joined MASO.
The movement for the actualization of the sovereign state of Biafra.
Exactly, which was already pushing for Biafran independence.
Right. So he steps into this movement that already has some momentum.
Yeah.
But then takes it a step further.
He does.
2009.
Okay.
He founds Radio Biafra, broadcasting from London.
Now, what was the thought process there?
Well, I mean, it was pretty brilliant strategically.
Okay.
It allowed him to completely bypass traditional media.
Which he often saw as hostile to the Biafran cause.
Yeah.
So he's speaking directly to the Igbo diaspora worldwide.
Right.
Cultivating a global support base and amplifying his message.
And amplify it. He did.
He did?
I'm thinking about that quote from his speech at the World Igbo Congress in 2015.
Which one?
We need guns and we need bullets.
Oh, yeah.
Not subtle.
Not at all. And that kind of rhetoric really put him on the map in a big way.
Yeah.
Both for people who saw him as this courageous leader.
Right.
And for the people who saw him as a dangerous provocateur.
Yeah.
But it really foreshadowed the controversies that would soon follow.
Because just a few months later, in October 2015, he's arrested in Lagos.
Yeah.
And the charges are serious treason, criminal conspiracy, intimidation belonging to an illegal organization.
This arrest really ignited tensions, didn't it?
It did.
Particularly in the southeast.
Yeah, protests erupted across southeastern Nigeria.
Especially in those Igbo majority areas.
For a lot of people in the region, his arrest was just further evidence of their marginalization within Nigeria.
Right, they felt like they were being targeted.
Yeah, and it fueled this belief that an independent Biafra was the only solution.
It's understandable in a way.
And even his detention became this huge point of contention.
Oh, yeah.
He spent over a year in custody.
Despite court orders for his release,
Yeah.
it was a constant back and forth, legal battles, accusations that the DSS was deliberately delaying his release.
The Department of State Services, Nigeria's intelligence agency.
Exactly. And it was during this time that Kanu started wearing Jewish religious garments.
While he was appearing in court.
Yeah, even referring to himself as a Jew.
That's so interesting.
It is a fascinating twist.
Because before, his image was so focused on Biafran nationalism.
Yeah.
Almost militaristic.
Right. This very public display of religious affiliation seemed to come out of nowhere.
It did. What do you think was going on there?
I don't know. Was it a genuine spiritual conversion, a strategic move to try to gain international sympathy, or something else entirely?
Who knows?
It just added another layer of complexity to an already complex figure.
It really did. Whatever the reason, it resonated with some of his followers.
It did.
They saw it as further evidence of his unique leadership and connection to a higher purpose.
It definitely contributed to the mystique surrounding him.
And then in April 2017, he's granted bail for health reasons.
It seemed like a victory at the time.
It did, but that freedom was short-lived.
It was.
In September of that same year, a military raid on his home results in the deaths of 28 IPOB members. And Kanu vanishes.
Gone.
And his disappearance fueled intense speculation and inflamed tensions even further. Where had he gone? Was he dead? Had he been captured?
So many rumors.
The rumors swirled for over a year.
Until
he resurfaces in 2018 in Israel.
Israel, of all places.
It was a real head-scratcher for anyone who had been following his story.
Totally. How did he get there? Who was helping him?
What was he doing in Israel?
It was a mystery that even seasoned analysts struggled to unravel.
Yeah.
But even with all the unanswered questions surrounding his reappearance, one thing was clear.
What's that?
Nnamdi Kanu was back.
Yeah.
And he wasn't going to be silent.
Not at all.
I mean, talk about adding fuel to the fire.
It felt like a challenge.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you can't silence me, I'm back.
Exactly.
And he jumped right back into activism.
Oh, he did.
Even taking things up a notch.
Yeah.
2020, he announces the formation of the Eastern Security Network.
ESN.
And this is where things get even more volatile.
Definitely.
The ESN was essentially the armed wing of IPOB.
Okay.
Intended to protect southeastern Nigerians from what Kanu saw as increasing threats from bandits
Right.
and Fulani herdsmen.
That was a controversial move.
To say the least.
Understatement.
He even demanded that southeastern governors ban open grazing.
Wow.
And threatened to deploy the ESN if they didn't comply.
That's a pretty serious ultimatum.
It really escalated tensions with the Nigerian government.
Oh, yeah. They saw this as a direct challenge to their authority, a dangerous escalation of the Biafran separatist movement.
And their response was swift.
It was.
January 2021, the Nigerian military launches an operation to expel the ESN from Orlu.
Orlu?
A city in southeastern Nigeria.
This was a turning point, wasn't it?
It really was. While Kanu initially ordered the ESN to withdraw,
Yeah.
it was clear that the conflict was escalating.
Yeah. And the potential for violence was growing.
And just a month later, in February 2021, IPOB officially declares a state of war with Nigeria.
After further military offensives against the ESN,
Yeah.
That's a pretty bold statement.
It was largely symbolic,
Okay.
but it highlighted the dangerous trajectory the situation had taken.
Yeah, I mean, despite Kanu's claims that the ESN was only meant to fight bandits, he had crossed a line in the eyes of the Nigerian government.
And they responded by officially labeling IPOB a terrorist organization.
Wow.
And accusing Kanu of inciting violence and threatening national security.
Setting the stage for his second arrest.
Which was even more dramatic than the first.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it.
June 2021, Kanu is apprehended in Kenya. Under circumstances that remain murky to this day.
Okay.
Some reports claim Interpol was involved.
Which they later denied.
Yeah. Others suggest he was lured there under false pretenses. Regardless of how it happened, he's swiftly extradited to Nigeria to face a new set of charges.
This arrest sparked international attention, didn't it?
It did.
And renewed outrage among his supporters.
They saw it as a politically motivated kidnapping.
Yeah, it raised serious questions about due process.
Yeah.
And the Nigerian government's commitment to upholding the rule of law.
Especially when it comes to dealing with political opponents.
Right.
And despite being back in detention, there were some unexpected legal victories for Kanu.
Like what?
In 2022, a court ruled that his initial 2017 arrest was unlawful.
Really?
Yeah. And ordered the Nigerian government to pay him compensation.
That's a pretty remarkable ruling.
It was.
But it didn't change his immediate situation.
No, he remained behind bars.
Right.
And his trial on the new charges continued.
So it's this real legal maze, isn't it?
It is.
On the one hand, the court acknowledges that the previous arrest was unjust.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he's facing new charges that could keep him in prison for years.
It really highlights the complexities of this case.
It does.
Touching on human rights, freedom of speech, the limits of dissent in a democracy.
Big questions.
And then just last month, December 2023, the Nigerian Supreme Court reinstated terrorism charges against Kanu.
Adding yet another layer to this ongoing saga.
This decision was a major setback for Kanu and his supporters.
Of course they were hoping for his release.
Yeah, and it reignited debates about the Nigerian government's motives.
Right. Are they just using the legal system to silence a political opponent?
It's hard not to see it that way, given the timing and the severity of the charges.
I agree.
But let's shift gears for a moment.
Okay.
And talk about something we haven't addressed yet.
What's that?
The controversies surrounding Kanu's rhetoric.
Yeah, that's a crucial part of this story.
Because it's not just about his actions.
Right.
It's about the words he's used.
Which have often been inflammatory.
Deeply divisive.
We need to examine these controversies fairly and objectively.
Yeah, to understand their full impact.
Absolutely. I think it's important to remember that Kanu's rhetoric has evolved over time.
Okay.
In the early days of Radio Biafra, his focus was mainly on historical grievances and the perceived marginalization of the Igbo people in Nigeria.
Okay.
He used strong language even then, but it was often framed within the context of self-determination and the right to peacefully agitate for independence.
But as the movement grew and faced increasing pushback from the Nigerian government, his language became more confrontational.
It did.
Do you think his 2015 arrest was a turning point?
I do. The prolonged detention, despite court orders for his release, really seemed to fuel his anger and the anger of his followers.
And it wasn't just directed at the government.
Right.
Some of his most controversial statements targeted other ethnic groups.
Like?
Particularly the Hausa and Fulani, who he blamed for many of the problems facing the Igbo.
This is where things get really troubling.
They do.
His language veered into dangerous territory. He made statements that could be interpreted as hate speech. Inciting violence against these groups.
Labeling them as enemies of the Igbo people.
And while this rhetoric resonated with some of his most ardent supporters, it alienated others who were sympathetic to the Biafran cause, but uncomfortable with the escalating violence and divisive rhetoric.
It's important to note that even within the Igbo community, there were diverse opinions on Kanu and his tactics.
Of course.
While some saw him as a courageous leader willing to stand up for their rights, others worried that his approach was too extreme and counterproductive.
Likely to lead to more bloodshed rather than a peaceful resolution.
That internal division within the Igbo community is something that often gets overlooked.
It does. It's easy to fall into the trap of seeing this as a simple us versus them conflict. But the reality is much more nuanced.
There are deep divisions within Nigerian society. But also within specific ethnic groups about the best way forward. So let's talk about some specific examples of Kanu's controversial statements. One that stands out is his infamous, "We need guns and we need bullets," quote from the 2015 World Igbo Congress.
That quote, delivered with such fiery passion, really sent shockwaves through Nigeria. It was seen by many as a clear call to arms, a rejection of peaceful dialogue in favor of violent confrontation.
Even some who sympathized with the Biafran cause found this rhetoric alarming.
Fearing that it would only lead to further repression and bloodshed.
And it seemed to mark a shift in his strategy. He wasn't just advocating for independence anymore. He was actively preparing his followers for a potential conflict.
And that's what made it so dangerous. It wasn't just empty rhetoric. It was a rallying cry that could mobilize people to take action.
With potentially devastating consequences.
Exactly.
And then there's his open death threat to former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo in 2017.
That was a chilling moment.
It was. In a video released online, Kanu is seen addressing a gathering of supporters at his home. Telling them that if anything were to happen to him, they should eliminate Obasanjo and his entire lineage.
Wow. That's intense.
This was in response to Obasanjo's earlier statement that all measures should be taken to stop IPOB.
So it's a clear escalation of the rhetoric, moving from general calls for violence to specific threats against individuals.
And it highlights the dangers of unchecked hate speech.
It creates a climate of fear and intimidation, where violence becomes seen as a legitimate response to political disagreements.
And it's not just threats of physical violence. Kanu has also engaged in what many consider hate speech. Dehumanizing entire groups of people and labeling them as enemies.
His statements about the Fulani, for example, have been particularly inflammatory.
He's repeatedly referred to them as animals and terrorists, accusing them of trying to Islamize Nigeria and displace the Igbo people.
He's also made derogatory comments about other groups.
Like who?
The Yoruba and Niger Deltans. Accusing them of being complicit in the oppression of the Igbo.
This kind of language is deeply problematic.
It is.
Because it creates a false dichotomy. Painting entire ethnic groups with a broad brush.
And ignoring the complexities and diversity within these populations.
It's a tactic often used by demagogues to stoke fear and resentment.
Exactly, turning neighbor against neighbor.
And fueling conflict.
And it's important to remember that these words have real-world consequences.
They do. When a leader with Kanu's influence uses this kind of language, it can embolden his followers to act on their prejudices and engage in violence against those they perceive as enemies.
And this can have a ripple effect, creating a cycle of violence that's difficult to break.
And this is why it's so crucial to analyze Kanu's rhetoric critically.
I agree.
To understand how it's been used to both mobilize support and incite division.
It's not about silencing dissenting voices or ignoring legitimate grievances.
It's about recognizing the power of words.
And the responsibility that comes with using them.
When leaders use hate speech and incite violence, they betray the very people they claim to represent.
Yeah.
And undermine the possibility of a peaceful and just society.
So where does all of this leave us?
Yeah, what does the future hold for Nnamdi Kanu, for IPOB?
Right.
And for the Biafran separatist movement as a whole?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
And it's one that's difficult to answer with any certainty.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, he's become the face of this movement, hasn't he?
He has.
And his arrest and detention have been a blow to IPOB.
Definitely.
But the underlying issues that are fueling this desire for an independent Biafra, those haven't gone away.
No. It feels like his story is almost a microcosm of this larger struggle.
I see that.
And if anything, the government's heavy-handed response might just be pushing more Igbos toward those more extreme positions.
Yeah, I mean, that's the danger when you suppress dissent without actually addressing the root causes.
You just create more resentment.
And make those extreme positions more appealing.
Exactly.
So what's the alternative?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
It is. I mean, Nigeria is a complex nation.
It is.
With a lot of diverse interests.
Many different groups.
How can they move forward in a way that acknowledges the concerns of the Igbo people without fracturing the country?
It's a massive challenge, and there are no easy answers.
I agree.
But I think it has to start with genuine dialogue.
Okay.
And not just between the government and separatist leaders, but within Nigerian society as a whole.
Like a national conversation.
Exactly. People need a space to openly and honestly discuss their fears, their grievances, their hopes for the future.
And that dialogue has to be based on mutual respect.
Yes.
A willingness to listen.
Even to those you disagree with.
Which I imagine is tough in a situation where there's been so much pain and mistrust.
It is. It's always easier to demonize the other side.
To dismiss them as unreasonable or dangerous?
Right, but that just perpetuates this cycle of distrust and division.
Yeah.
I think we need to start seeing each other as fellow citizens.
Okay.
Even if we have different visions for the future of our country.
Beyond dialogue, though, there needs to be some concrete action.
Oh, absolutely.
To address these systemic issues that have fueled this conflict for decades.
And the Igbo people have legitimate grievances.
They do.
They feel excluded from power, denied economic opportunities.
Treated as second-class citizens.
Exactly. And these issues need to be addressed through meaningful reforms.
Like what?
Reforms that ensure equitable distribution of resources, political representation, and access to justice.
And this isn't just about the Igbo people.
No, it's about creating a more just and inclusive Nigeria for all citizens.
So creating a Nigeria where everyone feels like they belong.
Exactly. Nigeria's strength lies in its diversity.
I agree.
But that diversity can also be a source of division and conflict if it's not managed well.
So how do they manage it?
I think they need to move away from this winner-take-all mentality and towards a system that values collaboration, compromise, and shared prosperity.
So where does that leave Nnamdi Kanu?
It's a good question. What role, if any, can he play in this process of reconciliation and reform?
Yeah.
Well, it's tough to say. His future largely depends on what happens with his trial.
Right.
But even if he were to be released, his ability to influence events might be limited. I mean, his rhetoric has become so divisive.
Yeah.
He's alienated a lot of people who might have supported the Biafran cause.
He still has a lot of followers, though.
He does.
Especially among younger Igbos who see him as a symbol of resistance against injustice.
That's true. And that influence shouldn't be underestimated.
Right.
But if he truly wants to play a constructive role in the future of Nigeria, he's going to need to rethink his approach.
What do you mean?
He needs to move away from the language of hate and division.
Okay.
And embrace a more inclusive vision.
A vision that recognizes the shared humanity of all Nigerians.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder if his time in detention has given him a chance to reflect.
Maybe.
A chance to reassess his strategies and consider a different path forward.
Perhaps. Or maybe the movement will move on without him.
Okay.
Finding new leaders and new ways to articulate their aspirations.
Only time will tell.
It will.
But we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
And it's clear that Nnamdi Kanu's story is far from simple.
Definitely not.
It raises some really crucial questions.
About leadership.
The power and the responsibility of leadership.
The dangers of unchecked rhetoric.
And the ongoing struggle for justice and equality in Nigeria.
Such important topics.
We hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on this complex issue.
And maybe even sparked some reflection on how each of us can use our own voices
to advocate for change
in a way that's both effective and ethical.
As always, we encourage you to keep exploring this topic on your own.
There's a lot of information out there.
There is. And it's only through continued learning and dialogue that we can move towards a more just and peaceful world.
I agree.
If you found this episode insightful, we'd appreciate it if you'd like to subscribe and share it with others.
Spread the word.
And until next time, keep diving deep.